This is the Active Directory Primer. My name is Michael Kraut.
The unauthorized reproduction or distribution of this copyrighted work is illegal. Criminal copyright infringement, including infringement without monetary gain, is investigated by the FBI and is punishable by up to 5 years in federal prison and a fine of $250,000.
If you have any questions or comments, you have the go-go box, which is at the bottom of the video. Let's get started. So we're going to talk about the basics of Active Directory. We're going to look at what a directory service is and how they work and how it correlates to Windows Server 2003. We're going to look at domains, trees, and forests. And we'll also be looking at the structure. And we'll talk a little bit about sites and services in there. And then organizational units. What are they? How do they work? What do we use them for? Introduction to group policy and delegation. How we can give responsibility to somebody else so we can go play golf. And we have a lab exercise. So let's get started with this. We're going to look at Active Directory. When we talk about Active Directory, what is it? Well, it can be compared to a phone book, a directory service. A directory service, when you look at a phone book, what do? We look up the phone number, we look up the address, and so forth. We have an identification. When we go to the Social Security office, what's the identifier? Well, our Social Security number. With Active Directory, we have what's known as a SID, which is a security ID. So Active Directory, all it is a phone book. It's a flat file database, like Excel. So we have the security ID. The security ID is a unique identifier. If you know anything about databases, we have to have something that's going to be unique throughout all of our different records. And when you think about a schema, the schema is Active Directory. We have the tables, which are going to be the classes, and the fields, which are the attributes. And the overall database is what's known as a schema. So it's a phone book. It has a SID for identification, which is a security ID. And we have two directory services modes. We have a domain, and we have a workgroup. A workgroup is helter-skelter. A domain is centralized administration, centralized services, one password to log in to mostly everything. Where a work group, you have to have a password to be able to share, to do anything. I mean, it's just anarchy out there. So when we look at the two directory services modes, like I said, I have work group, no centralized administration, no centralized resources, 10 or less computers. That's what is a work group. And then we have a domain. That's centralized administration. We're going to heaven now. Centralized resources. Thousands of computers, actually millions of computers that we can support on an Active Directory domain. Domain controller, that's Mama. Mama, may I? May I do this? May I do that? Okay, so it's the domain controller. The domain controller allows us to be able to centralize the administration, allows us to be able to have a central point where we go and ask for permission to do things. And then DC Promo. DC Promo is what we use to actually create a domain controller. It allows us to be able to create the Active Directory. Without DC Promo, we won't have our Active Directory. It's like the chicken before the egg. Okay, so we're going to look at domains, trees, and forests. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a forest. So we got the forest, which is finalvision.com, which is Final Vision. That's what we're going to be using throughout the within this whole course. So with the forest, we have what is known as a forest root domain. The forest root domain is our first domain within our forest. Okay, and we're going to have the schema master, which is the first computer that we put in, our first domain controller, which we put in the forest. That's going to have the 5 FSMA roles, which the FSMA roles are the domain naming master, the schema master, the RID master, the PDC emulator, and also the infrastructure master. So those are your 5 FSMA roles. Okay, that's going to be there. It's actually going to be located on the first domain controller within our forest, which is in the forest root domain. And then what we can have is we can have child domains. We have europe.finalvision.com and also asia.finalvision.com. Okay, those are the 2 child domains, and then this is the root domain. So the whole structure here is known as a tree, and we can have another tree, child domains, And then we have trees out here, newconcepts.com and newstrategies.com. These are examples of other trees. And what do they share? Well, they share the schema and they share the domain naming master. So those are the only things that are shared within the forest. And you can see those are the trees. So we have finalvision.com and we have newconcepts.com and newstrategies.com. These are the trees within the forest. And the forest, when you think of the forest, this is going to be our security structure. This is going to be the delineating part of our infrastructure for security purposes. So here's an example. If we have an Exchange server 2003 or 2007, we can only have one Exchange organization per forest, okay, to put it into perspective. So let's go ahead and look at OUs. Well, we have domains. We have North America geographical. That would be an example of OUs, so we can do it through geographical. Canada, United States. And then we have the accounting department. Canada and United States. So we can go departmental. Okay, within our domains, we can have what are known as sites. And a site is what is known as an IP subnet. I know that looks like second grade handwriting, but an IP subnet, this is what is known as an Active Directory site. And so an Active Directory site, what it does is describes the actual replication of our domain controllers. Okay? And I just use this slide real quick to show you that there is another object within Active Directory which is known as the subnet. Okay, but the OU is going to be inside the domain, and the domain can have an IP subnet or what is known as an Active Directory site. Okay, so looking at the objects, we have the accounting OU. We have a desktops OU. We can have a servers OU. We have accounts receivable OU and a mobile OU. And what we're doing is we're putting these objects within these different OUs. So an OU is just a container. It contains objects. So we have the servers. And what an OU allows us to do is be able to apply something called a group policy. And a group policy, what it allows us to do is be able to centralize our administration of our objects. So like our desktops, we can have a standardized desktop for Windows, for example. We can also, for servers, we can have it so that we create the security configuration wizard, use that, and we can create a security policy that applies only to servers. Account receivable OU, we can make it so that we can deploy software just to the accounts receivable OU, say an accounting package through a GPO. Okay, so OUs, just remember this, OUs allow us to be able to contain, or it's a container within Active Directory. So, delegation, called pass the buck. How many people out there like playing golf? Well, if you can delegate administration, you can play golf all day if you want. Not really, but that's the concept. Pass the buck. What we're doing is we're saying that we're going to give responsibility to somebody else to be able to do the job that we want to do. Lessen the load on the main administrator. Administrative delegation. So what we do is we go into our Active Directory, which we show within our demo, how we can administer or we can provide administration delegation. And what it does is, again, what we're doing is we're taking, because the administrator has so much pressure on them that they can't play Halo anymore. So what they do is they go out and they use the administrative delegation so they can delegate responsibility to somebody else. Group policy is a set of company rules. What it does is it standardizes our desktop, standardizes our environment. No desktop wallpaper, for example. Default website for IE. So what we could make it so that your default website is www.gogo.com. Standardized configuration for all users. Looking at best practices, what you want to do with the Active Directory, you want to limit the amount of domains. A lot of companies, what they do is they create domains, domains, domains. And all that does is that makes it more complicated within our environment. So what we want to do is we want to limit the amount of domains that we create. Domains are security structures. The reason why we want to create a different domain is if we're in a different country, or because of a different currency, different settings for passwords, a different security model. Use OUs. Use OUs instead of domains. OUs are easier to manage and to implement. Keep it simple, short and simple. KISS. What we're saying here is Microsoft recommends that you have one forest, one domain, with using sites for your different IP subnets. Keep it simple. One forest, one domain, multiple OUs. So we can use geographical OUs. So what we can do is we can take and we can say North America. North America has what? Well, it has USA and it has Canada. We could have Europe. Within Europe, we could have Germany, Italy, and so forth. Use GPOs to enforce business processes or business policies. And so what we're doing here is this allows us to be able to limit the abilities of individuals. If you want them to only use Notepad, you can lock them down to using just Notepad. You can make it so individuals cannot have access to the servers, you cannot have access to certain software, they cannot go into different websites. Here's an example. I had a customer up in Northeast Florida. What I was brought in is I was brought in as a Citrix consultant. What I had to find out is why the Citrix server was being hit so hard. And what I found out is by going through and using Perfmon, which is a system monitor, I did a baseline and figured out from there that individuals had free reign on the thin clients. So the thin clients, if you know anything about Citrix, well, a thin client's just a terminal server client. And so what was happening is these individuals that were in the front desk had games on, they were surfing the web, they were doing all kinds of different things. Well, by doing this, by finding the bottleneck, what I did is I locked down their desktops. I made it so that they couldn't do anything except for go to the websites that they were supposed to go through, because what I did is implement an ISIS server. And also, we locked down their desktops so they could not install software, they could not do anything that they were not supposed to do outside of the business processes. And so that's what we can do with GPOs. Create a written policy to enforce the GPO. Hey, it doesn't do anything if you don't have some type of written policy to back up the actual group policies that you put out there. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you create a written policy to enforce the GPOs. That way, if somebody breaks into your system, then you can prosecute them. Here's an example. With Windows NT, when it first came out, there was a welcome screen. And the welcome screen, what happened is somebody broke into a system. They took it to court, and the guy said, well, it said welcome. So they threw it out. So that's why you don't have the welcome anymore within your servers. So that's just an example of you have to have a written policy, you have to have some way of being able to enforce what you're doing through software. And be proactive instead of reactive. You want to make sure that you plan for something to happen, because if you know anything about Murphy's Law, when you don't plan for something, it will come and bite you in the butt. So you just need to make sure that you have everything, all your ducks in a row. So you got to practice. Exercise 1 is going to be installing Windows Server 2003 SP1. Exercise 2 is going to perform post-installation configuration in Windows Server 2003 SP1. So you're going to be looking at the actual installation. You'll be looking at certain files on the server and so forth. And then exercise 3 is configuring the server. The practice time is 120 minutes. Do you have any questions? Use the question and comment box. Thanks for joining us.